Hey there. In this video, we'll be taking a look at whether Cine EI on the FX3 produces a better image than not shooting in Cine EI. And if you're not aware of this, there's a recent firmware update for the FX3 which included Cine EI on this camera, and that wasn't previously available on this camera. It was only on the FX6 and the FX9. There was a bunch of other things that happened in that firmware update, and I made a whole video about that, which I'll leave linked down below if you're curious about that. Now, if you're not familiar with Cine EI, I did make a basic walkthrough beginner's guide explanation video about Cine EI for the FX3. Again, another video linked down below. So go check that out if you have questions. I'm not going to be covering how Cine EI works in this video. But what I want to do is show you as many real-world examples as I can and really try to get into the nitty-gritty here and see if the Cine EI mode actually gives you better image quality. For all these tests until the very end, they're both going to be shot at the base ISO. So we'll be comparing Cine EI with flexible ISO mode because they both shoot in Slog 3 and sgamma 3.cine, so it's a great way to compare that. Now keep in mind, Cine EI, the base ISO is 800, and flexible ISO, or any other way you're shooting Slog 3 on the FX3, the base ISO is 640. So for this example, Cine EI will be at the base ISO of 800, and also the exposure index will be at 800 just to keep it at the base. And then the flexible ISO setting, the ISO will be at 640, which is the base. So if you've been watching the channel, you know I try to do this like guessing game when I show comparisons, and I keep switching them up, and I'll show you a clip and then I'll tell you which one's which. But what I did here is I just kept the settings for A and B the same throughout the video. So A is always the same one and B is always the same one. Now this is kind of a long example section, but I just want to show you a bunch of examples and see if you can see the difference between them without having to keep guessing, so you can just watch it. And of course, go back and watch it a few times if you want to. For all these tests, as I said, I shot everything in Slog 3, sgamma 3.cine, XAVC SI in 24 frames a second using the FX3, and the 24-70 G Master 2 at a bunch of different focal lengths and apertures. Now, some of the tests were inside and some of them were outside. Now, when I was shooting outside, of course, the light was changing, and so I was changing the exposure with the variable ND filter. I try to get it to match as much as possible, both in the camera and with grading, but there's some variation there. So it's a little bit harder to, I don't know, tell there, but I just wanted to shoot some stuff outside. And then for the inside tests, I did both low and base ISOs. Everything's labeled for you to check this out. And for those examples, what I did was I got the exposure using a grade card for both situations and then just literally copied the color grade over. So any difference you'll actually see. So again, as I said, this is a kind of a long example section, but take a look. So, how did you do? I think it was really hard to tell the difference. Even while I was editing this on my large monitor, it was hard to tell the difference. And after going through YouTube's compression, I think it was probably even harder for you. So, A was Cine EI and B was flexible ISO. But I did want to share some outdoor examples just to show you and see that it was pretty similar. Now, as I said, I did try to color grade and color match these as close as possible, but even during the clips, the sun was changing, the exposure was changing, so it was really hard to tell what was going on there. So I did, when I bring the camera inside, I figured it's more of a controlled situation. We can kind of really see what's going on here. And as I said earlier, for the two modes, I got my exposure based on a grade card and zebras, and then I graded one and then copied the grade onto the other one, and so I could really see the difference between the two of them. And so as I started to look at this more and more, I was starting to convince myself that there was a difference between Cine EI and the flexible ISO mode. When I was zooming at 200%, I was starting to think that maybe the Cine EI looked a little bit sharper, it had a little bit more detail. But after I zoomed in even more and watched it several times, I was starting to realize that maybe it was just a slight difference of exposure and maybe a little bit of a user error in getting the zebras exactly right. I tried later to change the color grading around a little bit, and I get them to match almost perfectly. So again, I don't see much of a difference between image quality and sharpness between Cine EI and flexible ISO. And at the low base ISO here, I don't see much of a difference of noise. They both look super clean. And looking at the high base ISO, comparing Cine EI and flexible ISO, I don't see much of a difference here between image quality and sharpness, and the noise, again, looks very, very similar. And this brings me on to my next question about Cine EI, and that is noise reduction. So if you don't know, the FX3 and the A7S3 have built-in noise reduction that you can't turn off and you can't adjust. If you'd like to have that flexibility, you need to use an FX6 or an FX9. So I was curious, using Cine EI and the FX3, did that affect the noise reduction at all? I know we still can't adjust it, but I was wondering if it changed anything. And generally speaking, when you add noise reduction in camera, you will take away detail and sharpness, and it'll give it sort of a more plasticky look. There's a few kinds of noise reductions that are applied in camera, but that's generally speaking. So because from the test that I showed you and what I saw, I don't see much of a difference in terms of image quality, sharpness, or noise between Cine EI and flexible ISO, I have to conclude that the noise reduction is the same as it was without Cine EI. If Sony's posted anything about noise reduction in Cine EI and the FX3, please let me know in the comments down below. Now let's do a bonus comparison test that you probably weren't expecting in this video. Let's talk about how this camera now has a dual base ISO officially. So everyone sort of knew informally that before the update and when you weren't using Cine EI, you had a base ISO of 640 and 12,800, but now it officially does have a dual base ISO in Cine EI. You can set it at a low base or a high base. So let's take a look, because we have all these clips here, and see if there's a difference between them. Now keep in mind, for the low and high test, which you already saw earlier in this video, the lighting was a little bit different, so the shadows look different. But we'll compare first the Cine EI of a low base of 800 versus 12,800, and then the flexible ISO mode of 640 versus 12,800. I think the results from this were pretty interesting, both for the Cine EI mode and the flexible ISO mode. The high base was definitely noisier than the low base, but it looked sharper. So that was just kind of weird. I didn't really understand that. But I don't know, maybe that's, again, a difference in noise reduction. Not really sure, but it's just something cool to check out because I already had the examples. So what are my takeaways and conclusions about these Cine EI tests on the FX3? Basically, this camera's amazing any way you use it. I would say that if you are using FX6s or FX9s and this is like a B or C camera, I'd probably recommend shooting in Cine EI because everything will match on set and the workflow will be the same and it'll just be a lot easier. But I have to say, use whatever mode you feel comfortable with because the differences are minor. If this stresses you out and you're comfortable using the camera in flexible ISO mode or log shooting off mode, do that. Focus on getting the proper exposure, framing, and telling your story. Because what I could find in these tests here, the differences are pretty minor. I'm probably going to be using Cine EI for the time being because it's new and I kind of like the workflow, but use what you like. If you're curious about the update and the Cine EI mode, check out these videos over here. There's a bunch of stuff which I mentioned earlier. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.